So we are here to talk about story centricity and to modernize news workflows. I'd like to open by saying that over the past 2 decades, all news broadcast corporations have been trying to make this more efficient, trying to work on the bottom line. They have turned primetime shows to add revenue generators, reduce per-hour costs by increasing supply, and we've seen greatly expanded news demand, and the consumption has exploded as well. Story-centric newsrooms were supposed to be a path towards further efficiencies, and there have been great number of initiatives that have happened towards this area. Hopefully, this panel will be able to shed more light on renewed efforts in this space and what it means to newsrooms in the coming decades. With that, I'd like to introduce you to the panel. We have Jamie Clements. Jamie is an Emmy-winning news editor, newsroom production systems admin, and technical operations manager with 3 decades of news experience. He's a senior director of content technology at NBC Universal. He oversees content technology operations for all NBC-owned stations. And we have Fabian Westerwald. He's the vice president of product and strategy at ABC News Production. He oversees workflow and internal product teams. The first question actually goes to Jamie. Considering the significant changes in technology and audience expectations, can you touch on when was the last time an updated newsroom computer system was introduced in your organization?
Sure, thank you. Hello, everybody. About 15 years ago, we replaced our then were legacy tools for our NRCS, and we replaced it with a tool that had like a multi-platform approach to it. And, we didn't have a ton of platforms at the time, but, we used it in a way to feed some of those platforms, but we more leaned towards how we were already doing things. So I feel like we weren't ready yet. And now, fast forward 15 years later, like we have no choice. We're expected to feed more platforms than ever. And that's why we are looking for the next tool.
Fabian, what are some of the key priorities or concerns in selecting and implementing a new platform?
Yeah, I think first of all, to Jamie's point, obviously the distribution endpoints that we all have to service now are so vast and varied, and the user experiences that we have to enable are really different now than they have been in the past. And there's also a lot of opportunity that comes out with that we can take advantage of. So one of the biggest considerations is understanding that what is the vision from a customer perspective of how we're trying to enable serving our customers and being able to tell the stories, news stories as effectively as possible. And then looking at the internal processes that we employ in order to produce that content and get it out the door, and making sure that we identify the right pain points or the pain points we have with that in order to decide what kind of solution to build, right? So it's not so much for us about story-centric sake, but understanding those key pain points and solving for those. So that was really where we started, and that's always been our focus. And the core part for us happens to be that that's all about the media lifecycle. So how are we handling media within our environment? How do we make that as collaborative as possible and create a organizational principle around it, which happens to be, in our case, story-centric. That's what met the pain points, right? And then the last part is really finding the right partner, because in this modern environment and software-based production environment, you have to not just have a monolithic solution that works in and of itself, but it has to obviously integrate into all of the complex production environments that we have and all the systems that we have. So it's critical to find a partner for the long term and work with them in a way that's iterative and that's obviously based on trust, so that we can continue to evolve this environment, and that we're not in 15 years looking back and saying nothing has really changed. We haven't been able to keep up. We need to keep up together.
Glad you mentioned about pain points. Next question to Jamie around why are you implementing story centricity, and what are some of the pain points that you see with?
Before I get to the pain point, let's talk about story centricity. We realize that we need to move away from a show culture to a story culture. So a story-centric newsroom is an organization that, is organized around the story, not where it's going to be published or aired. So you need all of that information in one place to maximize collaboration, content sharing. Pain point is we don't have the right tool. We need to figure out what tool is going to be able to serve for all of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add to that. Exactly right. The same issue in our end, right? When I talked about earlier about enabling these end user experiences, the through point is the story. I mean, at the end of the day, as a news organization, that's what we do, right? We cover the news, we cover the stories that we cover, and that is also the through line between all of our different shows. So if you look at World News Tonight, GMA, our local shows, obviously our long form shows, at the end of the day, the core organizational factor is the stories that we're covering. And so when we talk, and this whole process, of course, started with really talking to our producers, our content creators, and understanding them in detail, what their pain points are. And so the three things that really came out of that was not everyone across all the shows and production environments and the news gathering teams knew who else was working on those same stories at all times. It was more of a manual coordination effort to figure out who those people were that were doing that work on those stories. And then secondly, what is the media? What's the best content that we're getting in real time? It's the speed of that is so fast that it's not always easy to track what's coming in for any particular story from the multitude of sources that we have access to. So obviously we've evolved that over time, but having that single system, Jamie's point, has not been really easy to actually implement. And then the third thing was really the editorial information, right? So in this modern environment, there's a lot of sources of that. Bringing that all together has also not been that easily feasible. So those are really the big three pain points that we're solving for. And, we're in the middle of figuring out.
We did hear about the production teams are able to operate more efficiently with story centricity. What are the benefits that it brings to journalists? I mean, Fabian, you can take.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think so. Again, we started with the journalists, and when I say producers and production, that they all have to think about that throughout their day. Obviously, how they're gathering the material, how they're then using that material to create the content. And so it's really starting with their pain point for them before we get to the broader business benefits. Because if you can't actually roll it out and get it adopted by the content creators, and if we're not making their life easier and we're not making them more creative, it's not really going to be effective, and it's not going to be adopted. And so that's the benefit for them is, again, what is solving those three areas of pain that they have. So if they can more easily and quickly understand who's working on the story they're working on and also find that content and have that editorial information, their job is going to get easier and also more effective and creative. And so when we talk to them about this project, it's not just so much saying, hey, we're going to roll out story centric, and everybody's eyes just glaze over when you use slang, just terms like that. It's really more speaking their language. How are we going to make their life easier? How to make it more creative, et cetera. And that's really what's driving it. And then the business benefit is, of course, that we have a clear media life cycle and a story life cycle that we can track and understand how it all came together end to end, and what analytics we can draw from that, and how, again, we can enable end user experiences as well by having that content and material pre-organized.
Jamie, do you have a perspective from NBCU?
I'll just build on what Fabian said. So I think the benefit to journalists is tenfold. They just don't know it yet. So our job is to explain it to them in their terms. So we at NBC, we went on a messaging campaign, right? We brought in the right people, the journalists, and the first question they're going to ask is, this is great. Story centricity is great, but what's in it for me? And our job is to explain to them what's in it for them so they know and hopefully buy into it, and they're your partner.
Speaking about adoption, what are the biggest challenges do you see in news teams adopting story-centric workflows and models?
I can start that out. I mean, look, the biggest challenge is just change management, right? People are used to working a certain way, and that's not always easy to overcome. So not to repeat ourselves too much, but the way you overcome it is to understand them and say, okay, it's not about just change for change's sake. This is not just a corporate initiative at a higher level of how, we need to implement this new system to make ourselves more efficient. Nobody wants to hear that, right? It's understanding what they're doing on a daily basis and getting really in the weeds and making sure that whatever changes we're then introducing to them, they can tangentially, touch and understand, and see real benefit from. So that's how you overcome that challenge, but that is the biggest one. The other big challenge is just the technical nature of it, because we do have a very complex production environment. We have a very complex news gathering environment, and we have a lot of existing systems and vendors. And, we're also in the middle, in our case, of moving into a brand new building, which has brand new technology as well, which adds, by the way, to the change as well that people have to go through. But the integration of the systems is a challenge because, it's all well and good to say we want to have media organized by story and coming in as soon as we acquire it, have it organized the right way. Actually achieving that requires a lot of collaboration with lots of different vendors. So that's on the technical side a big challenge.
O&Os, Jamie?
So where are we in the journey?
I think we were talking about challenges.
I'll agree with Fabio. The change management is huge. It's huge. And the only way you're going to, achieve that, getting over that hurdle of change management is getting the right people in the tent, making them part of the process. If you're doing a POC, you bring them in. They're part of it. They're giving feedback not only to you, but they're giving feedback to the vendors. And then at the end of the day, once you've defined how you want to work, then you can go and find a tool. No use looking for a tool if you don't know how you want to work first, or you don't want the tool to dictate how you're going to work. So once you collaboratively figure out how you're going to do that with your stakeholders, hopefully it'll be easier. And at the end of the day, they feel like they were part of the process. They can feel like, you know what? This is a tool that I helped build and set you up for success.
And so true. And I do want to also add to that for a second, the point of your point about you don't just pick a tool and then roll it out. And, you have to really.
We've done that.
Yeah, exactly. I think all of us have made mistakes in that space in the past in one way or another. I think especially on the tech side, there's a temptation to say, oh, this tool is so amazing. It's going to do all these great things. Let's just implement it. And that's pretty much always the wrong decision, right? The way to do it. And so to your point about, to your point on that, as bringing everyone along with you and really doing the design first. In this modern software-driven production environment and news gathering environment, that design becomes very complicated because it is not about just one tool that you can now bring in. It has to work as part of the larger whole and as part of the overall design. And that's, I think, is actually exciting about the times we're in, of being able to iterate and, from a software perspective, make those changes and build it in a way that's actually not customized for our production teams, but really works for them in a way that's true to their way of producing.
So we have been discussing adoption a lot. So when was the last time a major newsroom computer system changed at NBC O&Os?
When's the last time we changed it?
Yeah.
I think we covered that.
15 years?
15 years ago.
15 years. And ABC, again, maybe 20 years or 15 years?
Oh, yeah. I mean, long time ago. Yeah. I mean, it's obviously, again, has evolved over time, but it's also a whole different situation because when we talked about newsroom computer systems in the past, it was basically the rundown system, right? Now, what we mean by that, of course, is a fully integrated approach of having media and editorial information and collaboration and assignments and work orders and all of those things in one place. And to Jamie's earlier point as well, that's not something that really existed 15 years ago and has just more recently become more mature. Sure, there were different solutions and systems and people have been building on it, but it's not really been available in this integrated way. So,
in one sentence, what advice would you give to others who are looking to start with story centricity?
It goes back to kind of what I talked about, like bring your stakeholders in, bring them in and bring them in early. It's very, very important. You know, us as me, refer to me, and I don't know so much about you, David, but you know, I worked in newsrooms for years, but I was always like the technology geek, right? And I would see new technology, and I'd be like, wow, our newsroom people are going to love this. And you show it to them, and they're like, yeah. So bring them in the beginning. So you're not spinning your wheels. You're not wasting your time. Make them a part of the process from day one. And that sets you up for success. That's the advice I would give. And also, you know, make sure you're marketing what you're going to do. Market story centricity, but market in a way that's, you know, that's going to resonate.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'll answer it in one sentence, but but in essence, it's you know, don't implement it just for story-centric sake. Like, I think there's a lot of times a temptation again to say this is the latest and greatest new thing. So if you have a newsroom, maybe that'll come across your desk, or you'll think that, oh, story-centric, we should implement it. No, don't even think about it like that, right? Look at your environment, look at your newsroom, look at your production needs. Really understand them in detail, do that analysis, do the workflow analysis, work with your production teams and journalists, and really dial in what those pain points are, and then solve for that. And, you know, in our case, again, the media life cycle is what became most important. For other newsrooms and other and groups, it might be something completely different. Maybe it's the work order management, the way people collaborate. Maybe it's the way that editorial information is disseminated to different groups, or it's the publishing process. So all that obviously matters a lot, and whatever the priorities are is what you need to then really focus on, because the different vendor options and the ecosystem you're building is going to really depend on what those priorities are. So.
Oh, thank you. Great points. In fact, if I'd like to add something to it, when you start this journey, you can expect to actually start hitting all aspects of news production, starting with ideation, planning, materials gathering, edit, distribution, publishing. All of the aspects will come to the front, and you will have to address it, whether as part of the solution or whether as part of the business process. And this is one piece of advice that I would give out. One last question: as we go through this future, how are you mitigating vendor risks today? Fabian, would you like to start with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to the need to collaborate and form a long-term relationship, right? It's not just about doing the typical RFP and saying, okay, who's meeting all the requirements, or not all, but most of the requirements, or who is going to give us the solution right away from the beginning and meet those requirements. It's really about forming that long-term relationship and understanding how well that company is set up to deliver over those years, because nowadays it is all software. So you need to understand what their engineering team is like, what their product team is like, what their leadership is like, and be in those weeds. That's what we found, right? We really need to have access and have that transparency, because the integration is really complicated. It's not just about open APIs and having that documentation saying go to work. It's a lot more complex than that, and a lot more collaborative. So that would be my biggest piece of advice, and something you need to do in order to mitigate that risk. Otherwise, you might end up in a situation a year later where you don't have that ability to integrate properly, and then you're not able to solve those problems that you obviously set out to solve.
Fabian, obviously you're further along your journey. Jamie, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I was gonna comment on that because I'm talking about risks, right? So we are deep into a program to identify what our next story-centric tool is. And yeah, we're doing POCs, and we're looking at things from, RFI and RFP and numbers and all that stuff. It goes beyond that, right? It's not just, oh, I'm going to see what this tool can do and then say, oh, well, they scored great here, I'm going to pick this one. It goes beyond that, right? Because there's a lot of other risks in what you're choosing. You got to look at external factors. You got to look at how the users feel about it. You got to look at the companies that you're potentially doing business with. Like, are they going to be around in 5 years, right? those are the risks that are hard to like mitigate and make it so black and white on a page, right? Those are things that you really have to have discussions with your team about, do the right research, and hopefully when you make the right choice, you feel good about it.
Thank you for the detailed answers. Now we'll throw open the forum to Q&A. Any questions for the team?
I think your mic is off. Can we, was it? Oh.
Hello.
Yeah, all right.
Thank you for a lot of information. It's very helpful about what goes on inside your organizations. I'm wondering if statistical issues come up in terms of, well, you're looking at an audience at a particular time in a particular situation with advertisers in the mix, so that storytelling, it would seem, could really vary depending on the need, the style of the producers and journalists that you're working with. And I'm wondering if there's, one issue, statistical representations of all that would be one possibility. The other is models. Could you throw at a journalist team examples of the cutting style, particular storytelling styles that you think they should trend towards?
That's a good question. I don't know if I can answer all of it, but what I will say is if you have all of your journalists, right? In today's world, at least in our organization, you have journalists feeding different platforms, doing different styles, creating different types of content for different platforms. And they don't really understand what each is doing. The reason why, they're not in one tool. They're not collaborating together. They're not seeing each other's work. To me, if you have the right model and you have the right tool to do that, then there's some learnings or some takeaways from that, right? There's somebody who works for linear TV might see you as somebody who's doing something on TikTok and be like, that's really cool.
Yeah, and I think a big part of it, I kind of touched on this earlier a little bit, is the end user experience, and that's kind of what you're touching on, right? There's obviously so much change in how consumers consume news, and that also changes how we produce content. We, of course, have to stay true to our core competencies and of how we tell those stories. But, in the context of story-centric, part of the goal is with these solutions is that we have the ability to organize all the content upstream, keep that all connected, and then on the output side, enable much faster, user experiences. So one example would be, let's say we're covering this hurricane and we have all this content coming in. If we keep that all consistently organized as part of that story and we create those different types of outputs for social media, for our broadcast news, for streaming, in real time, that all has to stay together so that we can then have a much more dynamic experience, for example, on OTT or on our direct-to-consumer applications, where that hurricane would become a story in and of itself, and now all those different types of pieces of content have to be served up to the right people at the right time. That's a very manual process if we don't have it organized along the way, right? So that's another benefit of story-centric, a big one that we didn't talk a lot about, but it really comes about once you do solve these problems for the content creators and the journalists. So this is one of the outcomes that we then benefit from. And it also brings along with it the ability to really drive analytics much better. We'll have data of not just what's performing well on the consumer side, but what was the content that we used to create that, right? So connecting all of that information together is a huge benefit for analytics and analysis.
Just to add to Fabian's point, we will try not to be prescriptive to cutting styles at all. We want to adopt what the individual show preference is, what the target audience is, etc. At some point, we'd like to, as Fabian pointed out, marry up the analytics to the cutting style and making sure that the processes, the editorial processes are still relevant to the end consumers. Next question.
Thank you guys very much. I'd love to dive further into the analytics and the KPIs within the organization. Have you guys rolled out anything to judge the story-centric approach? Has it worked, in terms of communication, particularly to the producers and reporters in the field?
Well, so we're both, we're a little bit further ahead in this rollout, but we're not there yet, right? So we just started this process for us, and it's in 3 phases. So the first one is, news gathering. So all the content coming in and organizing that by story and making sure that those things are in place. That's just getting started. So we don't have data yet on how that's changed our, KPIs and so on. Then the next step after that is the production workflows, so rundown and live production integration. And then the last step is basically the, this piece of it and really putting those parts together and the distribution piece and having all that analytic roll back up. So we're too early in the process to really answer your question on that.
And for us, we're very early on in this journey, right? But I think from an analytics perspective, there's probably some really good insights when we get there. For the own stations, we have 28 rooftops where we're creating content, right? And they mostly create just with themselves. It's been hard to collaborate with all of them. And the journey that we're on now doesn't include just all of our O&Os, but also includes our NBC network news friends and all their brands. I think once we put all of that together, there'll be a lot of analytics and KPIs to take away from that.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, we have hypotheses around this, right? I mean, there's a lot of thoughts around the raw material and how much are we gathering and where are we getting in front and how is it actually getting used. And that's very hard, again, to analyze unless you have a solution like this where you can track that from the beginning. So, and that's not just to say to, just then save money and potentially, but it's more really about the creativity, like how can we use that material maybe even more efficiently? Is there different types of content we can create out of it? What is the creative thinking that producers are utilizing? This is, maybe coming back a little bit to the different types of cutting styles you were mentioning or content creation styles. Having that all organized, you could then imagine a situation where at the end of this, terrible story, for example, is just on the top of my mind, you could see all of the content we created for it across all of the local stations that are maybe involved, network side, and see where that material came from that they used. And so now you have ability to share between the content creators as well. Hey, I didn't even realize that this person did that X type of content production, but it's all there now in this one place, and they can use that for next time to iterate on that and get even more creative.
I'll just build on that a little bit. If you look at our station group, right, we have some newsrooms that have 300 people. We have some that have 20, right? And they're probably producing a lot of the same content. The ones with 20 are struggling a lot, right? But if they can have access to content that kind of reduces those friction points, the KPIs will just bubble up.
Yeah, and right, exactly, and the reusing of that content and the updating of, again, you have somebody do something really creative in one market or one area of the business, and someone else sees it and they can just repurpose that in a way and make some slight changes. That's obviously going to be a big win. So visibility is the problem there, because we could do it now, but it creates a lot of manual coordination to understand where that content is actually being created in a large organization.
Does it answer your question?